Good morning, true believers. This is Joel Clark here. You probably already know that because I've been coming in front of this camera for the last couple of years and talking to you about Tian Shang and other punch-related activities. Alright, so I stayed up till 4 o'clock in the morning at a Denny's last night, playing my game with a gaggle of friends, some of whom are very new to the game. And I just woke up about like an hour and a half ago and watched some Red Letter Media and ate chips for breakfast because I'm a health-conscious individual. And I'm just going to sit here without my pants on, my cat in the background, and that's going to guarantee me some viewership, apparently. That's how cats work. Look how cute she is. You know you want to watch this shit. Oh crap, I said shit in the first minute of the video. That's fine. That's fine. We're going to do this raw. I'm just going to talk about the game. That's it. So, okay, this is actually a continuation of the campaign you guys saw, Blood in God's Eye. There is a session after the one that I did to promote it for the Kickstart, and in that session, they encountered Oily Manu, and he completely just railed at least the Silver Phoenix with a combination of poison and his Shadow Viper laser beam that RAVE gets to shoot. I love that thing. It's really fun to describe, and it is a very over-the-top anime attack where you just kind of like shoot an energy beam. It's very Street Fighter, and it's great. It's really great. It's a high-rank attack, so I was happy with that. So the first thing that was notable to me about this session is that it was powerfully roleplay-centric. It was very roleplay-heavy. There was a lot of talking in character, and I had a really strong control over the pacing as a result of that. And so the content came out much more slowly. Oh, excuse me. And in a more natural way that kept everyone engaged. That was the first thing that struck me about this session. And I'm really happy about it because it's what it's supposed to be doing. I didn't actually change anything significantly. I think I was just running it with more confidence and more of a feeling that I, as a GM, have a job to pace the flow of content. And so I think maybe just putting that discussion somewhere in the text itself will help out. One of the things that helped with that immensely was making certain that I was the one who dictated when events happened. Like a lot of times, I would have a player say, well, I want to do this before this happens. And because I had such a good, tight control over this is happening, here's the chronology of events, this is how long this takes, I was able to pretty conclusively say things like, okay, but you haven't had a chance to do that. That takes X amount of time, and this is Y amount of time since the last time you said you were going to do anything. Therefore, you can start doing that, but that is a tactical trade-off. That trick right there, just knowing how long things take and understanding like how the rules allow them to do things and at what speed they allow them to do things, really cleaned things up. A second thing that helped with that was understanding the difference between a scene and an amount of time. Because a scene can vary in the length of time it takes, but certain events within the game chronologically take a certain amount of time. It takes a certain amount of hours to sleep. It takes a certain amount of hours to walk at like a brief pace, like that kind of like slower pace, and cautiously explore something. It takes a certain amount of minutes to have done a certain action. And the game did a really good job of reinforcing those things. I didn't actually see many actions that crested 4, and I think 5 was our highest ranked action. So another thing that struck me about this session was that the beefed up effect chart did a pretty good job of keeping the power tier about where I want it to be very early game. So I was happy with that. Another thing that struck me was I think I've screwed up the new calculation for how prana works. I think the pool being capped at 5 on open chakras in the early game is extremely restrictive, and I don't know what I was thinking there. I need to go back over that whole body of thought and kind of like suss out why I thought that kind of reduction was necessary. It feels more like there should be a much higher amount that they initially get. I don't know. It doesn't feel like enough, and because especially the strong hero had 5 prana to begin with. That's nowhere near enough prana to do like anything, and like they can kind of make up for it because they have a lot of effort. But yeah, I went back to it being 10 prana per pool as a start out. I don't I don't know why I thought that was a good idea. I don't. A complete mystery to me. So that struck me. Um, Effortless. I've been doing some thinking about it in between, because I did a session with David earlier this week, and I did this session, and between those sessions I realized that using it as the core of an action doesn't work. What you have to do is, because the idea behind Effortless is that you will at some point be on the receiving end of an ass kicking and not have any dice left. The effort pools in the game, they're vulnerable to getting ganged up on in a way that's a little bit counter to the fiction. So I was like, okay, how about we just give them a resting defense, like an armor class, basically. And that also kind of became a thing where you don't... It sort of serves the same function that D&D has with armor class, and also the passive things. And that's I think it's a 5th ed innovation. It might have been a 4th ed innovation. But basically there's a certain number that you hit as base competency before you roll. And it really sped up the game. In a lot of cases, a character would be like, I want to... Like, someone famously punched a concrete wall to break through it. And they had not only strength mastery, but it was the Lone Wolf, or it was the Brotherhood of Freaks character, Cave Buffalo. So when he hit, he also got to use his enormous size to increase the damage as well. So he would get a 25 result without rolling. And although that wasn't enough to break all the way through the concrete, after a few minutes of chipping at it with his fists, he was able to kind of jackhammer through it, and it still felt really cool, even though it was more limited. So I was really satisfied with the way that felt in play. And a lot of times, there were like kind of passive perception checks. Like, what do I naturally notice? Which helped me get to the point where I would kind of know what information in a description or in a situation to dole out, and where I'd draw the line and say, okay, anything after this, you have to make rolls for. You have to you put more effort into it. And I liked that a lot because it kept players engaged. Whenever players are thinking, when players are presented with a situation and not given all the information that they want, and they want to ask questions, and they're thinking of ways to engage with how the game functions to get more information, that's a really good way to get them present in a scene and get them like proactively playing your game. And that happened consistently last night. So really happy with that. I may have to revisit senses, as a matter of fact, to give myself a couple of examples of things they will and will not notice in terms of like obviousness or hiddenness or like distance from an observer. That wound up being pretty important stuff. So I might revisit the senses chart and say, okay, at what distance do you have normal like human observation? At what level of detail can you observe something that is within the parameters of your senses? Like, stuff like that. You know, how obvious of a thing can you notice? Another thing that we actually wound up innovating a few different kind of random things. Like, I implemented kind of a general knowledge roll based on your clan, which is basically like, if you roll a d10, the likelihood of you knowing a given piece of trivia or a given piece of information is just kind of a 1 to 10 scale, and as long as you roll that or above, because I kind of did it as an inverted scale like that go, then you just happen to know that. Because I don't really necessarily like writing down long lists of things that characters know or do not know, but players' memories are surprisingly robust about information that they possess. So with that, what I was able to do was kind of control the flow of information as far as culturally, you know this because you were trained in this. And that really helped to like anchor the identity of the characters within the context of where they came from in the setting. Also, it was really nice to have the motivations of the characters on the pre-gen sheets. It's another little stroke of genius that I had, apparently, where every character knew why they were getting together, and they also had reputations based on what they did in their clan and what the other clans thought of them. So there's this whole social thing that grew up around it, and it immediately made them feel like complete badasses. And they were doing stuff, like, without my prompting at all, were like writing letters to their clan to ask for allies to help the new allies that they were getting, like, because they wound up helping the Golden Lions. And the Brotherhood of Freaks character, the guy who played that, was like, well, I really like these guys. I'm going to write to my clan and see if I can't get some allies to come down and help us fight this war against the Shadow Vipers. And the Shadow Viper that was playing had a reputation where he was kind of like one of the good ones with the Shadow Vipers, because he fought in a previous campaign, which I just kind of decided to link to this one, or previous playtest, more accurately. He had fought and killed a fallen Golden Lion who'd gone over to the Shadow Vipers, and he was still like wearing his heraldry on his arm, and the Golden Lions recognized that, and the Shadow Vipers recognized that, and no one else immediately recognized it. And there was little things like that that added a lot of like nuance to scenes. The formless technique with the Silver Phoenix character, I've decided gives them psychic powers where they can like psychically talk to people, but it's a very one-way radio transmission thing where they can open a link to someone and say things to them, and they can open a link and listen to someone, but they can't like read someone else's thoughts to get any kind of advantage or anything like that. So it's a very limited like radio sort of thing. So yeah, a lot of little innovations I kind of innovated on the spot. Let me see. What else? I've noticed that this game runs very old school style. There are a lot of gaps in the rules that are there. They're not exactly there intentionally, but they are anticipated. And you are expected as a GM to pretty consistently make rulings on how does this function. So the whole Battle of the Elements thing actually kind of extends to the entirety of the game. And actually, this is pointed out by Alexander Macris in his wonderful book, Arbiter of Worlds, which is when you run even a very simple game with very simple rules, if you're doing it in like a role-playing game in the context of a campaign, you wind up making rulings on spots that aren't covered by the rules or that are vague in the rules. And whenever you do that, it kind of makes a doctrine of law for your campaign, sort of the same way we evolve laws naturally in the real world. And Alexander Macris being a lawyer, or at least having a lot of legal training, he understands that process really thoroughly, and he articulates it well in the book. And I think it's great advice whenever you're heading into a campaign. Now, the problem that I have with that is that I, as a game designer, of course, want to tighten the ship as much as possible before we set sail with it. Like, that's why it's taken so long to get to this point. But I might actually stop. Because last night, although there were plenty of holes in the vessel, I found that every journey will expose different holes. And I want you to be able to take any journey with this. And that's the real purpose of the vessel. You know, it's seaworthy. It is. But you have to maintain it. And I think a good, healthy campaign you will maintain in your fashion. So I think what really needs to be in the book somewhere is a meditation on the reality that this game is this is a game that is dealing with a very, like, both the real circumstances of a real world in terms of physics, and also the magical circumstances of super powered, like, kung fu demigods. And, like, gods and magical elementals and all kinds of crazy shit. So the confluence of those things and the way they manifest in your home games is going to be something I cannot anticipate, and no one could possibly anticipate. And that's good. I don't want to anticipate all those things before they happen. I want something unique to happen at every table, and I'd like to have that happen consistently, if I'm being honest with you. But because this is what the game is going to go into territory-wise and description-wise, I can't make a solid ruling for all of those and put them all in the book. The book would be the size of the Empire State Building. It wouldn't work. What I need is a robust set of guidelines for allowing you to make adjudications and rolls. And honestly, what I found was most helpful was going back to the effects charts, going back to the way combat balances, and the lines about what's an attack, what's a defense, that kind of stuff. Because we have solidified those so well, we didn't make the mistakes that, say, Exalted Second Ed did, where it was like, and this happened in the game, this came up a lot, where I had players, and players do this, and it's completely, this is something that every role-playing game should anticipate if there's going to be combat. They do things like, well, if we surprise them, don't we get X? Like, do they get to defend themselves? Do we get an advantage? Do we get this? One of the most brilliant things 5th Ed did, and I powerfully saluted for this, was it took all of those corner case rulings, all of the grapple checks, all of the grappled versus pinned versus choked out, all of the I attack from above and you're below me, all of the minor modifiers, all of the surprise rounds, all of that shit, all of it. And they're like, advantage or disadvantage? The end. That's fucking brilliant. It really is. And it's brilliant because of a few reasons, but the one that works in the favor of my game that doesn't actually work super well for 5th Ed is it assumes an incredible competency on the part of the players, of the player characters, rather, and their most powerful enemies. I like that assumption, because if a PC, or if an NPC is below that threshold, where they're an actual, like, martial artist threat of any variety, they're just a person, I don't really need them to be more than a roll away from dying. And whether that's a skill roll, whether that's a failed roll on their part, or whatever, it's something to manipulate the environment, or whether it's an attack, it's irrelevant. They are just a person, and they're fighting against demigods. They're toast. They're toast. And sometimes that's great. You know, sometimes not having to worry about it is the best thing you can do for your game. But if they are kind of on the level of the player characters, even if they're a lower tier, but they're kind of on that same level of operation, where they too are mystical martial artists with incredible powers and competency, the assumption of the previous game and the assumption of this one is that they're competent enough that they have certain safeguards that kind of insulate them from that incidental death. You have to focus to change them. And whenever a player has their attention called to and the resources of their character are required to significantly change something, but not everything, that calls out those significant circumstances in their minds. And the effect on them at the table is wonderful because the player characters are very competent, and they're competent along these more narrow channels than before because they have the more focus than before, but they're also broadly competent. And so they feel robust and they feel stable, and they feel like they can do exceptional things. And they also feel like, although they can overcome most obstacles relatively easy, when they are overcoming more significant ones, like punching through a concrete wall or trying to figure out a language that is completely unique that they just encountered, those things feel like more significant hurdles. And so whenever they put more resources into overcoming them, it is something that's not universal across character types. You really need to be focused in intellect to allow you to get to that level of operation to where you can decode a language you just encountered that you've never heard before just by hearing a few snatches of dialogue. That's something you can do with intellect. It gets really nuts how the level of operation you can be with intellect. But like, that is still something that requires you as a character to have techniques that make you smarter and have masteries that make you smarter and still roll reasonably well and put significant effort into that. That feels like, oh, wow, he is really smart. It helps to, in the moment and with the confluence of those different elements of your character sheet, show the focus of a character. Which, because of the sort of sloshiness of the way the rules are kind of unfocused and how open and versatile they are, I was worried that wouldn't happen. Happened beautifully last night. We had a clearly really strong dude. We had a clearly really smart dude. We had a guy that clearly had, like, mystical powers. Like, it was all these things are really, like, clear lines. So, really happy about all that. One of my favorite parts of this campaign was that the players were talking about it after it concluded. And like, they were excited. They were asking me questions and they were making plans, and they were completely immersed in the circumstances of the fiction. Nailed it. Stuck the landing, folks. That's exactly what you want to see from a campaign. I was confident when I was running it. The whole time I felt like I was really in control of the situation as a GM, so I've given the GM enough tools to be able to do that. And I will probably need to consistently give them clean advice on how to do that. But that's something I've been worried about for a long time. It hasn't felt right at all. And I don't know if that was just because I was feeling less confident before or because it needed to get designed at this point. But however it happened, it's there now. It's where it needs to be. I think we're maybe a paragraph or two of solid GM advice away from this game being exactly what it needs to be to do exactly what it's supposed to do. That's a really exciting moment for me. It's never been there before, but it was there last night, and it was there the whole session with no lumps. Like, there was never a point where I was like fumbling for something to do. There was never a point where I felt like, oh, my game isn't ready for this. There was never a point where the power that the characters were able to pull off was either well above what I wanted to happen or well below. They were right near that range, right within that power level. There are a few inconsistencies that should probably be ironed out, but that's going to be more like looking at the powers and redesigning them a little bit and making sure that there's more consistency with those. But for the most part, this felt exactly right. Yeah, we've finally hit our keel, and we can now move forward with more design. So I was really happy with this. That's not to say that every subsystem is completely done. I want to give them another check. I am doing that with the processes is the next thing I'm doing, and I'm going to re-examine skills and the logic of skills and what have you. There were some questions that I didn't have to answer during this session that will need to answer eventually. Like I need to figure out how crafting magic weapons is going to happen and how I'm going to make that interesting, and how I'm going to make the limited resources something that players want to get more of. Because like if it's driving them to go and like push further out and conquer more territories and get more resources, that's what that system is for. It's to push you over the next horizon into more dangerous territory where there is stuff to fight and stuff to get. That's what it's for. That's what it's for, folks. Um, I am I'm trepidatious about the power level of characters because they are extremely powerful. And I wonder if I have perhaps put in too many safeguards that pushes them from robust to invincible. I worry about things like that because I want the broader campaign to be something that can feel dangerous so that they're not just wandering into the lion's den punching the lion every single session. You know, like it should be dangerous to go into unexplored apocalypse territory where there are deadly villains and huge powerful monsters. It should. And it should require heroes facing danger to change that circumstance. And I do think it should be changeable. I just think it should be something that risks death. So yeah, I'm going to need to do probably a significant amount of tooling with that to make the spice right. I think revisiting monsters and vehicles is going to be necessary. The vehicles seemed a little bit tough in this. They did actually prevail against an army of tanks in this session because it was an interesting session. They wound up fighting an entire brigade of tanks. There were 10 tanks with 10 troops each in them, so you got 100 troops and 10 tanks, and they were led by 2 rank or degree 3 Shadow Viper warlords, one who was like an assassin and one who was like a warlord, like a fist fighter warlord guy. And they prevailed. It took them 2 rounds, and at the end of round 1, I think that every tank was disabled in one way or the next, and I want to say that all of the NPCs were dead. Right now, there's still a power that the Silver Phoenix has that allows them to attack an entire field at once. And I've always ruled in the past, and I think that this should be a consistent ruling, at least in this campaign, that whenever you're able to hit a whole field at once, anyone who's in a group has to defend individually against that. They can't defend as a group. And so, if he gets higher than a rank 1 attack against them, they just die. There's a psychic shockwave that gets pulled out. And it was probably too powerful, but it was such a cool effect, and they were using my previous ruling to rely on that strategy. So, like, I didn't want to rob them of that. It may have diminished the combat as far as challenge goes, but it was really cool to see. And he had to deal with a significant amount of ass kicking before then, because he was kind of flying over the battlefield with his little psychometric harmony repelling whatever that he gets, and the bad guy assassin shot him with a beam of evil energy, and then hit him with a poison dart that paralyzed his nervous system, such as that his legs and his spine, everything that allowed him to locomote, was paralyzed. And I ruled that because the way his psychic power works doesn't require his legs necessarily, it still is channeled through the same chakra meridians that allow you to move. And if that's paralyzed, he started to plummet. So he started falling to his doom, survived the fall and bounced, and then just brought down the wrath of God to crush everyone with his psychic shockwave, Tetsuo style. And it felt... He also did the thing where he got mutation points for that. So I felt like that was appropriately cinematic and fun. And also, it was founded in the previous rulings of the game, which, as I mentioned, I feel like is kind of a canon of law. So, pretty happy with it. Good note that I will probably need to re-examine powers that hit large amounts of space, because the newer, more robust field mechanics allowed that field to be subdivided into different areas, which made the positioning of the characters a lot easier to track and a lot more robust. It felt like they were maneuvering between tactical areas. I really liked that. I really did. I also had the Brotherhood of Phoenix guy, or the Brotherhood of Freaks guy. Brotherhood of me, because the Brotherhood of Freaks guy was the brand new player who'd never played Tian Shang before. I played other things with him. I played Dune with him before, and he's a pretty cool character. But he was really excited about the game, and he's like, he got, when he wrote his letter to his clan, they sent 87 followers and a minor hero who more or less swore allegiance to him, and so we got to try out the followers mechanics, which worked really robustly. The game still has trouble with the amount of things you have to track in really big battles. Now, I don't think that's a huge flaw, because every game has that. Like, you can't really run a war between 10 war machines, 200 troops, 5 PCs, or was it 4 or 5 PCs? No, 4 PCs, their minions, and 2 powerful NPCs in any campaign without that becoming a nightmare of amount of things to track. And I think that, considering the raw amount of things I had to track, the game had enough tools to do it. But remember, I was on a quarter of a table at Denny's behind a GM screen, and I was running out of room to track stuff, because you have to roll the dice for all that stuff. So, I in the light of the way field mechanics work now, in the light of the way I've kind of opened up the game a little bit, I think I need to re-examine how armies operate, because I feel like groups of 10 feels right. That feels like a good max amount to put in a single group. And it also feels like it kind of scales the game back to personal scale really nicely, because you have 10 dudes who can fight, and then you have their reinforcements who are behind them. And I'm fine with that. But the logic of, you get to have one of those groups per player that is fighting them, is a little bit awkward. I'm not a huge fan of that. And I don't really know how to change it. I don't know if I should make it so that they can have as many groups as they want come to the fore. Because, I mean, like, I don't really want to be rolling 100 dice. I'm not going to lie to you. Part of the reason that I want to break it down into smaller groups is just so I have to roll less dice as the GM. And I like the idea that, well, I might make it per area or something like that, or even say that a certain area can only allow a certain number of attackers, maybe, which will naturally limit the amount of dice that can get grouped. Actually, that's probably the best way to do it. Just kind of make a soft, like, part of the rules where I'm like, hey, look, there's, a certain number of groups or a certain number of people should be the maximum amount you allow in a given area in a field, and you should make a note of that whenever you make that ruling. Ruling is going to have to be a thing that I at least devote a paragraph or two to in the GM chapter, because, like, you're going to need to do that, folks. It's a skill you're going to have to acquire to run a game that's as robust as this one. I'm really digging the word robust today. I only had like 5-6 hours sleep, and I've not had my coffee today. I'm going to spend the rest of the day writing, and yeah, maybe doing some laundry. This shirt's getting a little stale. This is the shirt I was at Denny's at, and if you've ever been to a Denny's, you know you need to do laundry the next day, at least for whatever you wore to the Denny's, and I was there like all night. I will say that the people at the Denny's were incredible. As usual, I got fantastic service from fantastic people. All I had was a cup of coffee, and it was always fresh. Denny's is a great place, especially right now with the world in the middle of its slow-moving apocalypse. Like, it's really nice to be able to go to a Denny's and stay there all night and just drink coffee and water and play a role-playing game. I felt like I was 12 years younger, and I was doing this stupid shit like I used to do when I was a kid. That was back when I was playing Exalted 2nd Edition, just to give you an idea of how ancient I am. And it felt good. It felt good to do that again. So I'm a little rambly at the moment. Oh, God. Okay, so those are some initial thoughts. Effortless works really well as defense, and it works really well as a baseline for competency, and it works really well for skipping having to roll your effort. So what I found was players would kind of ask, can I do this? Right? This is the sequence that I wanted. Can I just do this? Well, you'll need to see what rank you get. If it was more difficult than just, yeah, you can do it. Like walking across the room, yeah, you can do it. Punch through concrete, well, what's your effortless? Then they would tell me their effortless, and we'd look at the chart, and if it was sufficient, we could just do it, depending on time constraints. But if they were like, no, I want to do it immediately, I'd be like, okay, that's going to require at least, and I'd reference the chart, it would require at least this. Then they hit their effort. And that sequence where they go from description to static mechanics to dynamic mechanics, that is exactly the sequence that I want. And because it kind of sets the pace for how they try to interact with the game world. And you'll notice that each one of those things tactically and situationally engages them more as they continue to ask those series of questions to get to the point where they're going to try to do their action. I really like that. It's quick, because the first two are just little yes-no answers, really. It's yes-no versus yes-no plus consult. Then it's what do we need? And I really liked that sequence. And it's not necessary to always go through that. You will, for the most part, stop most things they try to do with those first two. Really liked that. And whenever we did that, the rules where you could use up to your pool to do techniques, that really cleanly banded which techniques they had immediately. And what I found was they kind of just treated those as extensions of the character. So the character that can manipulate water was consistently using his water manipulation powers. The guy who could walk on walls was consistently doing that. The floating sight was consistently floating. The guy who had crazy kung fu punch magic with his fingers was constantly doing that. They were just extensions of the character, which is perfect. That's exactly how it needs to feel in play. It's just kind of another one of their effortless actions. I love it. I love that shit. And because of how succinctly most of those were written, it wasn't super complicated for all of them. The more powerful moves, the more complicated ones, got to have bigger impacts on the game. Riptide Defense, the shield bubble technique that the Brotherhood of Freaks character had, he would put up whenever he went in, like before he went into battle, and just hold it. And he would just kind of be walking around with his bubbles. That's what he used his focus slot to, because it's sustainable. And I was fine with that. Why? That's how he wanted to play things. So when he went into combat and the significantly more powerful Shadow Viper Warlord burst out of his tank and hit him with his chainsword, the guy got like a 47 to hit him, and the shield was 46. So we were just like, well, that really blunted it. And the fun thing with Riptide Defense is it explodes and hits them. So then he got blasted by Riptide Defense. It was really awesome. It was really awesome. Oh, wow. I did note that I need to solidify what it is that imbalances do. Because they're still sort of vague in my estimation. Here, just a second. I got that. Alright, sorry about that. Somebody was messaging me. Anyway, it's not clear what imbalances do exactly still. Like, it's not clear what you have to describe or how that influences what you can do. I need to spend some time with that. That's been a problem with the game for a while. And it was a problem with Legends of the Woolen, too, where, when, especially, like, a round or two in, it became so crippling to take the imbalance that, like, you really could not make that decision. You really couldn't. So, I don't know. Like, I don't want imbalances to be a death sentence. I need to think about what it is I want them doing in the game, because they vacillate between being, like, just so horrifically crippling that it is a death sentence, or they don't do anything. Like, what I want, I guess, is between that, where they are doing something, but it's not so horrific that it's dooming you to not be able to use the combat. So the problem, though, is there's really 2 or 3 things about combat that are really important. Like, can you get to or away from a situation, and can you bring your offensive and defensive capabilities to bear as necessary? Like, those are the 2 things that you have to deal with whenever you're fighting in this game. And anything that impugns on either of those, even somewhat, it's hard to reduce it by degrees, you know? So, I don't know. I really don't know. I don't know if I should make it a difficulty shifter, because I feel like that's a little bit too mechanic-y, and one of the things I want to avoid is having to constantly check your penalties. I would prefer it to be you just get less dice, but it is so many less dice that, I don't know. It's just, they're a little bit too crippling right now. Again, one of the most significant things in this game is the gulf between amounts of effort you can bring to bear. So there's the amount of effort dice you roll and the amount of prana that you have and the amount of powers I can give you. Like, that's basically the combat. So if you are losing 4 or 5 dice in the second round, you're toast. And like, it just kind of makes a failure spiral naturally. I do think that characters should be wounded, but I mean, like, anytime that because I mean, like, the nature of that, the nature of how wounding would work in this is that you're fighting and they hit you hard, and if you compound that with, oh, and now you can hit them less hard, all you're doing is like stacking an advantage on an advantage for the opponent. And that's not really fun to be on either side of that, because on the one side of that, you're hitting an opponent and they just stay the fuck down and they die. So that's a failure spiral. I see that a lot with the NPCs. Or they hit you so hard that you really can't function for the rest of the combat. Now, I will say that with PCs, there are two things that kind of help to insulate that. Number one, PCs have more aggregate health and more aggregate effort than the opponents that they fight in general. It's like a general rule of this game is you will have multiple PCs with significant amounts of health and effort, and you will have a smaller number of enemies that they will fight. It's very rare that you're outnumbered by powerful adversaries. So it's not unheard of, and as a matter of fact, this game is robust enough to deal with it, but the situation is generally that. So within the situation that I generally see, if the players are on the receiving end of an ass kicking early on in the campaign, early on in the fight, what will happen is they will have to make significant compromises in later rounds, usually the second round or later. Usually I see combats go about 3 rounds or so. They can vary, but that's the average is about 2 to 3 rounds. And so if the very first round is getting crippled, then the later rounds are struggle for them, but in a way that I find to be tactically interesting and that encourage like robust role playing and robust strategy. So it's not terrible for a player to get an ass kicking early on, although it is less fun for them. I think the overall experience isn't terrible, and it's actually pretty good. But if the NPCs get a significant ass kicking, they very rapidly die. They get crippled, and they're no longer a credible threat in later rounds. And sometimes, as soon as they get injured, as soon as one good attack gets through, their ability to threaten the players essentially vanishes. And no matter how many ablative health levels, no matter what I give to the NPCs, they just can't recover from an ass kicking. And I wonder maybe if it's a tactics thing, and I should think about, like, here are some tactics the bad guys might use to mitigate this, or if it's a design thing, and I really need to rethink the way these powers work. Because it's not like this is the only game that happens to. Anytime you have a group versus a single powerful adversary, the tactics are such that unless the adversary has, and Final Fantasy games are a really good example of this, unless the adversary has more or less categoric immunity to their tricks and a vast amount more health than them, I'm talking like thousands or millions more health than them in some circumstances, like ludicrous amounts, they're not really a credible threat. And if you look at the Final Fantasy games especially, I think those kind of give you an idea of, because those are, especially the first Final Fantasy is straight up based on D&D, and later ones are to a less degree, and eventually they kind of abandon it and they become their own thing. But it really does show, like, kind of what you need to have the Final Fantasy fights. And the Final Fantasy fights are interesting. They're more of a prolonged tactical situation that requires you to really, like, make very small amounts of progress over a large amount of time in a changing circumstance. So Final Fantasy fights are kind of a high watermark for as far as, like, kind of what I want out of fights. And that's also something that one way or the next you see in things like Dragon Ball Z. The fight against Vegeta and Goku, the very first Vegeta Goku fight, is a really good example of kind of like the apex of what I want fights to feel like. I want them to be very long. And I want there to be a lot of back and forth with big attacks and big risks. And I want there to be a very slow, dwindling resource that eventually gets you to the point where you're bloodied and angry and broken and you're covered in wounds. And as the fight goes on, I do want there to come to a point where the abilities that you had at the first part of the fight you no longer really have. And that's a delicate thing to try to consistently recreate, you know? First of all, that was a scripted fight, so that's not in any way a game. And second of all, the scripted fights, the non-scripted fights that do that, the games that do that, the elements that they have in common are the bad guys have broad categorical immunity to tricks that can just hit them with a hammer that makes them not work, and especially things like blindness or paralyzed that makes them non-entities. Like, they more or less have to not be able to do that, or else they go down like chumps. A famous example of that is the I can't remember the name of the thing in Final Fantasy VIII. I was actually just rewatching the spooning experiment thing of that because it's incredibly funny, if a little bit dated in its humor. But yeah, that guy. There's like a devil character you can summon from a cursed lamp, and he's extremely powerful. He hits you with a gravity-based spell, and he'll come up and whack you and kill you. But you can cast blindness on him. He's vulnerable to it. So his only real finisher is that physical attack. So if he has blindness, he will not hit you. But gravity reduces you to low hit points, and in Final Fantasy VIII, when you're at low hit points, you can access your most powerful attacks, your limit breaks, until you die. And that's forever. So basically, he puts you in a state where you're invincible and hit him with your most powerful attacks. So even at low levels, you can whoop this guy's ass and get a powerful summon really early in the game. If you happen to be able to cast blindness on him, and if you happen to have known that trick. So it makes a joke out of the encounter. And I think it's a clever exploit. It's fun the first time you discover it, and every time after that it's a chore to get the powerful summon. You know, it's not really, at that point it's not a challenge anymore. And one of the things that Final Fantasy told us is that a real challenge is more satisfying than the illusion of a challenge. The thing about Final Fantasy bosses is that you are more or less preordained to beat almost all of them. Some Final Fantasies, that's more of a toss-up, and you might actually lose, but it's more of a resource planning thing. Because if you have the theoretical capacity to beat one of those things, like if you have the on-paper capacity to do it, there's no real skill involved as far as executing that plan. You just have to stick to the plan. Whatever the strategy is that will lead you to victory, just keep hitting the buttons. And in a role-playing game, there's no execution difficulty. It's the same thing. You're not hitting buttons, you're rolling dice, but functionally it's the same thing. There's no actual player skill and a skill check. What you are doing is presenting them with a tactical puzzle. And it is a tactical puzzle that has an emotional element because they're attached to their characters and the continuity of the characters, and the stakes of the conflict are important to them. So I don't, especially in a role-playing game, I don't expect the same level of like strategizing, but the players really surprised me last night, and they put a lot of strategic thought into how they were approaching a situation. Whenever they realized they were going to have to fight an army of tanks, they actually armed all of the Brotherhood of Freaks followers that came down with anti-tank weaponry, which they found through searching through the compound that the Golden Lions had. That was like this ancient prison complex. Actually, it was an ancient genetic experiments laboratory, which functioned as a prison because it was trying to keep the genetic experiments inside of its walls. But there was tons of munitions on the bottom. And I actually made another on-the-spot ruling, which was, okay, these things are old and unreliable, and they have not been repaired. You found the most sterling examples of them, but that still only gives you a small chance that they'll work. So each time they fired them, they got one shot each with these anti-tank weapons. It was roll a d10. If you roll a 4 or higher, they function like you would expect them to do. So 60% chance of them working. No, 70% chance. If you roll 2 or 3, they're duds and they don't fire. If you roll a 1, they explode. And that, whoever's holding them, whoever's around them, they're just dead. They get like it's like a rank 6 or something explosion. So, yeah, they got annihilated. But I rolled for all 10 groups. There are a couple of duds, but no explosions. And every single ordnance that the players got, that was the case, because one of the tank that they punched to death in the session previous to that, they decided to get into and pilot and just move the gunner turret and fire at one of the lead tanks. And it was the same thing. It's like, well, you guys didn't maintain that. It's been rusting out here for the last couple of days in rain in a marsh. So roll a d10. If you roll a 1, you're the recipient of this explosion. And rolled a 6, fired like normal. So they took some real chances there, but they thought really strategically about that. They even hid them. They like waterproofed their weapons and hid their Brotherhood of Freaks guys under the water because they could breathe there. They iced that over with their water charming mantra, and then the guy who could summon weather, the Shadow Viper, coated all that in a thick mist, and he rolled a 6, all said and told, for concealing them. So like they really thought ahead. You know, they really planned out their strategy, and they kept doing that. They had a very tactical approach to the game. So, although I don't expect that level of tactical robustness every time a player goes into a fight, I feel like I should start, because, like, that might make for a more robust game, and you can make a more challenging and therefore more satisfying game if you assume that you are going to require that level of carefulness and strategy from the players. And this is a game that does kind of encourage it, because when you roll your dice at the beginning of the turn, they're all laid out for you. So yeah. I think what I'll do with imbalances is I will have a brief list of things as far as like good practice when it comes to being a GM if you're going to not take the penalty. The penalty's pretty crippling, and I might actually alter the way the penalty works somewhat. I'm not really sure what I want it to do exactly. I think 1 dice per rank of damage you have taken is too much. It drains you too quickly. So I might make it a 2 for 1. I might just buffer it like I did with the effect charts. That might work. Who knows? I might do something else. I really might. I might just say, like, I don't know. I don't know. I'm not really sure what I want it to do exactly. So I'll think of something, though, that makes it a little bit more functional, as far as, like, instead of having to sit there and adjudicate yourself because you're the person who's making the judgment calls. I feel like it works really well. Like, the wounds work really well for when they're player facing, because you as the GM can adjudicate, well, your arm is broken, so you have to, you know, you can adjudicate for them and kind of, like, you know, micromanage their actions a little bit. And I'm not usually a fan of micromanaging, but in these cases it's really good because you present them with those tactical trade-off scenarios. You present them with here is the thing your character is powering through. Do you have a clever solution? And if not, like, you're going to have to power your way through it. And that works really well. It puts enough pressure on them that it's good for gameplay. With the NPCs, though, I'm not feeling that pressure as a GM. All they're feeling as players is either triumph, that they've crippled the enemy, or a sense of frustration that they're not really crippled sufficiently. And I'm a pretty clever guy, so I can think of ways to kind of worm out of the worst parts of the descriptive parts of the drawbacks. So I think that that's not an uncommon trait in GMs, and I should probably just have a robust set of here's the real penalties you'll be taking as a GM that are concrete, and just don't worry about trying to worm your way out of them. These are just what you have to do. So there might be a division in imbalances between what is player facing and what is GM facing, and I think that might just be the way we have to do it. It'll be easier to run, so yeah, I'll probably do it that way. Let me see what else. You know, actually, that might solve a lot of my problems if I just reduce the penalties for imbalances in general and differentiate the way they face the different parties. I might be able to get the results I want more consistently. Are the bad guys powerful enough and robust enough? I need to fix the prana. I'm going to go re-examine that. That was the big standout of the session as far as a negative, is that my new take on prana is all over the map. I don't know what the hell I was thinking. The older prana I'm very used to, and we kind of just defaulted back to that, but I'm not sure what I was doing with this higher stuff. Another quick takeaway before I wrap up here is that lowering effortless down as far as I did, because it jumped up to 2 really quickly and then got to 3 pretty reasonably quickly after that. And now there's a big band in the middle of the degree chart, which is 2, and there's only 3s on the end and 1s on the beginning. And I think that is probably for the best. It did mean that the powerful boss character and his minions have the same level of effortless, though. So that's interesting. It is. That's pretty interesting. Actually, I might have reduced theirs too much. I think they're actually supposed to have 2, and I only gave them 1 for defense. Oops. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. Don't at me. Anyway, so effortless works pretty good. Maybe it doesn't do enough. I might actually make it a little bit higher. Bad guys, too much of a death spiral for them. Probably examine the consequences of imbalances. Piranha needs to get looked at. So, takeaways, we are really close, people. This felt very right, and I felt like I had the tools necessary to run the game. I've been almost an hour on here, which I didn't mean to do. I am going to go put pants on, and then I'm going to write all day. Actually, I might not put pants on. Anyway, bye.